Thank you, Ajit. That was a very inspiring introduction. I hope I'm able to live up to the billing. And of course, dear friends, pleasure to see all of you. Some I'm meeting after a very long time, and that makes this evening even more special. I have a PowerPoint presentation. I hope you can see. Right.
I think the people who are on the extremes
perhaps
come to the
if
center.
anybody has any trouble, just move across to this side.
Because this might
Because
be
this
obstructing.
lecture usually gets in the way. The topic being transition in America and China, implications for India, with a great deal of exercise of my intellect. I've broken up the presentation into three parts. One is transition in America, one is transition in China, and the last part is implications for India. Some quick points I'll make on the US transition. Next slide, please. Right. The voter turnout has actually dropped this time by something like 5%, and this has happened in the face of an increase of about 8 million in the size of the electorate. On the Republican side, this has caused a fair amount of heartburn, because the suspicion is that they were not able to motivate their supporters to come out in large numbers and vote. And of course, as we go along, we'll see how much reality there is in this fear or assessment on the Republican side. There were more women than male voters, which is actually not that unusual. And one of the most remarkable things that we have seen in the case of President Obama in particular is that he has a very strong constituency among single women. And that has been proven again this time, partly because of his position on social issues, also because of his position and the democratic position on the kind of role that the state can play in providing social security to the less advantaged segments of society. I wanted to mention, of course, the fact that some of the statements, the campaign statements made by the Republican candidates, not at the presidential level, but among the senatorial candidates, there were some bizarre statements made about things like legitimate rape, and that you should never allow abortion, no matter whether it's incest or rape. And this really turned off a lot of people. One particular seat was the seat of Richard Lugar, a real establishment figure in the Republican Party, but the person who unseated him in the primaries made these kind of remarks, and so the Republicans lost what was presumed to be a safe seat. We'll see how it affected the Senate result later on. Race obviously played a very important part. This is something which has been extensively commented upon. Among the whites, obviously, Romney carried the vast majority, and among the blacks, 96% voted for Obama, as per the latest figures that have now been reaffirmed. The big fight was over the Hispanic vote, and that went decisively in favor of Obama. More than 60% voted for Obama. Here, obviously, the main issue was immigration, and I think this is one place where we're going to see some kind of change within the Republican Party's positions on this issue, because going into it, they had taken very tough stances on the question of immigration. Of course, when we do talk about race and demography and all that, it is nonetheless important for us to remember that this same demographic in 2010 delivered a real hammering to the Democratic Party. So it's not as if there's something inbuilt into the demographics which gives the Democrats a lock on victory in all future elections. If the performance of the government is not up to the mark, they're going to be defeated, and it can be done. And in fact, the 2010 results, Obama himself called it a shellacking. A few quick words about the Electoral College, because it has been touched upon that this is not truly a directly elected president. Had that been the case, the national vote was much closer than the actual outcome is going to be in the Electoral College. The Electoral College is really nothing but a collection of people who are elected in the different states to meet in Washington, D.C. in the middle of December and vote for the president. The convention is that these electors are bound to vote as they have been instructed to, as they have been voted for by the electorate, but there have been electors who have gone rogue, and almost every time, including in 2008, there is the odd vote in favor of some other candidate who's not even on the slate. So the Electoral College has its own funny ways of operating. But it doesn't really make a difference because by and large the discipline is maintained. What happens after that is that this has been commented upon. What happens is that in most states the system is that the winner gets all the seats available from a state. Now the number of seats in a state is the sum of the number of members in the House plus the 2 senators. Every state has 2 senators. So since there are 435 members in the House and 100 senators, you get a total college of 535. 3 more are added to represent Washington, D.C. That's how you get 538 seats in the Electoral College. Hence 270, the magic number, the majority. Now, in some states, 2 are Maine and Nebraska, where they don't follow the winner-take-all system, and there they follow the Electoral College, the House, the districts of the House of Representatives. Each one of them elects a senator, an elector, and therefore you can have a situation in Maine and Nebraska where it isn't a winner-take-all situation. After they have voted, then they remit their vote to the House of Representatives, and the House of Representatives at its first sitting in January of the following year, which is going to be January 2013 this time, they then formally declare the president elected. That is the full process of the election of the president. Now, some features about this particular campaign. The campaign contributors, the largest contributor for Barack Obama this time and last time was the University of California. I haven't seen any clear indication whether it's Berkeley or LA. Perhaps it's the 2 together. Because I think $1 million for any one university is a bit steep. So I suspect it's both the UCB and UCLA together contributed $1 million. The next largest contributor was Microsoft, and then Google. The funny thing is that for Mitt Romney this time, the largest contributor was Goldman Sachs. And what's funny about it is that in 2008, Goldman Sachs was the 2nd largest contributor to the Barack Obama campaign. And that's, again, last time, University of California was number 1, Goldman Sachs was number 2 for Barack Obama. This time they switched sides. All of the investment banks actually switched sides, and they all backed Romney. It was a bit of a puzzle for me why they should do this, and I figure that the largest part of the reason was for the Dodd-Frank Act, under which a large number of restrictions were placed on the functioning of the investment banks. To that, then they added the Volcker rule, which prohibited what's called proprietary trading. The result was that the investment banks were extremely unhappy with these kind of restrictions, and some of them actually went very openly negative on Obama. I remember seeing an interview with one of them, and they asked him, so what would you advise Obama to do? And he said, I'd advise him to drop out of the race, which was a very strong statement to make, given that there was every chance that he was going to win. But they really broke cover on this one, and they were very aggressive in their campaigning against Obama. Now, of course, the flip side is that the IT and software companies backed Obama, and in a way, I think that's something which we can leverage. The US system runs on IOUs, and the fact that these companies have contributed so significantly to the Obama campaign means some of the issues on outsourcing, at least, we may be able to leverage into softer positions. Now, I have mentioned this point. The other thing that struck me was that the oddity about the way the campaign went. The person who was receiving large contributions from the IT companies, which were very keen on outsourcing, was the one who was hammering away against outsourcing. And the person who was, that's Obama of course, and Romney, who was getting a lot of money from the investment banks, kept banging Obama for having bailed out the banks and for having given them very privileged treatment. And the Dodd-Frank Act, he said, you've defined these as too big to fail, so you're committed to saving them even in future. So the conclusion I drew was that hypocrisy is not the monopoly of Indian politicians only. However, now we come to the pattern of second terms for US presidents. Take a look at this table. What's remarkable is that every president who wins a second term wins with an enhanced vote in the Electoral College. This, I'm starting from Eisenhower because before him there was the 4-term presidency of Franklin Roosevelt, so one doesn't know how to compare that. But post-war, these are the presidents who have won second terms, and the only person whose vote fell second time round is Obama. All the others increased their vote, including, you'll see here, Ronald Reagan. You'd think 489 out of 538 would be hard to improve upon. He got 525 in the 1984 election. So we have to conclude, I guess, that the endorsement of Obama is less wholehearted than it has generally been in the past, when the president has been re-elected. Of course, some have not been re-elected. That's a different story. There is one other feature about second terms. Most of the second terms have run into very serious problems fairly early after the re-election. Go back to Nixon, the Watergate burglary started actually in 1972 during the campaign itself. The next second-term president, Reagan, ran into problems with Iran-Contra. Clinton, the Levinsky affair. Each of them, within the first 2 years of their second term, ran into these huge problems, which in a way put a question mark on their legitimacy, certainly a question mark on their ability to deliver their agenda for the second term. And that becomes very important because everybody is saying Obama will now be working for his legacy, and he's going to have to handle two very big challenges: the war in Afghanistan and the fiscal cliff, which we come to presently. A little bit on the election to the Senate and the House. I'm giving here the figures for 2008 and the midterm elections in 2010 and then the current round. And you see that the big changes happened between 2010 and 2008. whether you take the Senate or the House. In fact, in the House, some of you will certainly remember this, the swing towards the Republicans in 2010 was the largest since 1928. I think they won some 66 additional net seats went to the Republicans in 2010, which actually illustrates what I began by saying, that demographics isn't everything. There comes a time when people say, well, look, these guys are just not performing well enough. And what you see in 2012 is really nothing but a re-endorsement of the outcome of 2010. Of course, this is also the time when we will be having the first Hindu in the House of Representatives. It's a lady called Tulsi Gabbard from Hawaii. And I was watching one of her TV interviews, and she was saying that she's going to take the oath on the Bhagavad Gita. So that's something which we'll be seeing for the first time on the floor of the House. Is Obama stronger? The short answer is yes, but there are caveats. As I said, the margin of victory is not very convincing, especially if you set it against the pattern of previous presidents who have won their second term. Of course, on one issue he is clearly in a stronger position. He had very clearly argued in his campaign that he was going to raise, or he was going to reverse the Bush-era tax cuts for those people who earned over $250,000. So in that sense, the argument that is now going on how to balance the budget, he certainly has the endorsement of the people. That much is undeniable. But of course, there is another catch, which is that, there is a budget, there is a deficit ceiling beyond which even Congress cannot vote funds. And that ceiling is about to be hit. The current national debt is just under 16 trillion, and the ceiling is $16.39 trillion. So the Republicans have this other card in their hands, if you will, that if they just don't agree on anything, then the fiscal ceiling will be hit, and there will be very serious consequences for the spending programs which Obama is committed to. With this, we can now move on to the Chinese side. Just some bold numbers, the number of delegates. This was, of course, the number of delegates to the 18th Congress. They selected / elected 205 full members of the Central Committee and 170 actually it's 171. The total number is 376. There is one Tibetan in the Central Committee, and that is Padma Choling, who is the equivalent of the Chief Minister, Premier of Tibet, of the Tibet Autonomous Region, and also the Chairman of the People's Congress. And there is one Uyghur in the Central Committee. His name is Noor Bakery, and he is similarly the equivalent of the Chief Minister of Xinjiang. Otherwise, there aren't too many ethnic minorities in the Central Committee, and that conforms to the pattern that we've seen pretty much from the very beginning of the foundation of the party. The Central Committee appoints 25 full members of the Politburo and 7 members of the Standing Committee of the Politburo. I've got the names here for you and their faces. One gets to see Xi Jinping's face all the time, but some of the others you may be seeing less frequently. The important point to note about Xi Jinping is that, of course, we've all heard that he's a princeling. His father was a very senior party member, and one of the more liberal ones. In fact, Zhao Ziyang records in his memoirs that when he was facing attack, when Tiananmen was going up in flames, the only senior party member, one of the elders, who spoke for Zhao Ziyang was Xi Jinping's father, Xi Chongshun. To what extent the son will follow the father's legacy is one of the big questions that we'll all be watching out for. Xi Jinping also served in the Central Military Commission, and this is something which you don't often find in his biography. For 3 years, he was the aide to a person called Gan Biao, who was the defense minister. And in those days, the defense minister was also the secretary general, or the secretary, if you like, of the Central Military Commission. So Xi Jinping actually worked very closely with the CMC and with the DLA for 3 years. Thereafter, he spent a lot of time in Fujian province, right opposite Taiwan. So he understands both the economic importance and the strategic importance of the Taiwan question. And I think this is going to be one of his early priorities. The party chief in Shanghai was caught in a scandal, in a corruption scandal, sacked in 2006, and that opened the way for Xi Jinping to take over as the party secretary in Shanghai, and that brought him into closer contact with Jiang Zemin. Jiang Zemin, of course, as everybody now saw at this present Congress, played a very important role in the proceedings and in the personnel selection. And this is a role which party elders have continued to play right from the days of Mao Zedong and in the company. Number 2 in the Politburo Standing Committee is Li Keqiang. Li Keqiang is obviously going to be the next Premier of the State Council, that is the Prime Minister. His career graph is very closely linked with that of outgoing party chief, Hu Jintao. So he has got his man in at number 2 in the Politburo Standing Committee. And this is noteworthy because his predecessor, Wen Jiabao, was number 3 in the Standing Committee. So this reflects in part, if you like, the kind of compromises that the leadership make in placing their men in key positions. Zhang Lijiang is the man who replaced Bo Xilai, the famous Bo Xilai, who was bounced from Chongqing. And I suppose, in a way, this is also a message to Bo Xilai, that had he not confronted the party establishment, he would have been in the Politburo Standing Committee. Zhang Lijiang is now positioned at number 3. My guess is he would be the new chairman of the National People's Congress, which is the parliament. Please note, he has been awarded the Hilal-e-Pakistan by President Zardari. Then you have the 4th ranked person, Liu Chengsheng, and my guess is that he would be the chairperson of the CPPCC, which is the sort of equivalent of the upper house, in that it allows for membership by non-party members and gives a greater weight to the ethnic and other minorities in the country. Liu Yunchan is the ideologue, so he retains his number 5 position, but what he will actually be doing, we don't know yet, because the total strength of the PDSC has shrunk from 9 to 7, and the 2 people who have been dropped were the people who were doing ideology and national security. These 2 posts have been relegated, if you like, to the Politburo rather than the Standing Committee. Wang Qishan will probably be the deputy, the first deputy prime minister, and Zhang Gaoli we'll have to see what exactly he will do. But the thing to note is that with these 7, you have, the pattern is very clear. General Secretary, Prime Minister, the Chairman of the National People's Congress, Chairman of the CPP, that stands for Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference. So these 4 are automatically members of the Standing Committee. 2 more are here from, they are the ones who are going to make way in 2017 for the 2 new leaders. Excuse me. I'm obviously not used to talking too much. Number 5 and number 7 are the people who will make way because of their age. And the people who fill their positions are going to be the next leadership, the 6th generation. The person who comes in at number 5 will be the next Secretary General, and the person who comes in at number 7 will be the next Premier. That's how it's going to be played out. Hu Jintao, there has been a lot of speculation about what happened to his candidates, how he performed, and the general assessment is that 5 out of the 7 standing committee members owe allegiance to Jiang Zemin and only 2 to Hu Jintao. But he has played his cards rather well, given that he had a very serious challenger or a very serious, powerful person to contend with, namely Jiang Zemin. And the kind of applause that Jiang Zemin got at the Congress made it very clear that he was indeed very popular in the party. One of his closest aides was Lin Chihua, who was the head of the General Department. This is the department that does the secretarial work for the Congress. And so his removal on the eve of the Congress was really quite an unprecedented event. He was caught in a scandal. His son crashed while driving a Ferrari. He was drunk. He had 2 female companions, and the scandal was suppressed for quite a long time. But this happened in March, but around September the story broke, and Lin Chihua had to be sacked. Interestingly, Hu Jintao placed him in the United Front Work Department, which is the department that deals with Tibet. Tibet is very important for Hu Jintao. He made his career in Tibet. He went there as party secretary in 1988, and 1989 was the 30th anniversary of the uprising, after which His Holiness the Dalai Lama fled Tibet. And Hu Jintao introduced martial law in Tibet, which was the first time in the history of the PRC that martial law was declared. The upside was that the Beijing leadership took rather well to Hu Jintao, especially after Tiananmen, and that marked him out in Deng Xiaoping's eyes as a leader of the future. So at a very young age of 49, Hu Jintao was made a Politburo Standing Committee member, which is really quite unusual. The other noteworthy point is that he has appointed another Hu is not related to him, Hu Junhua, as a Politburo member. He is 49 years old, the youngest member in the Politburo, and a man who served with him in Tibet. Clearly, Hu Jintao, as he is stepping aside, is concerned about the role of the Tibetans in particular, the minorities as a whole. I suspect that the assessment in the top levels of the Chinese Communist Party is that they are going to face serious challenges going forward, which is why he has brought in Hu Junhua. My guess is that unless he does something wrong, or if Hu Jintao begins to lose power after becoming a party leader, chances are Hu Junhua will become the next one of the members of the new standing committee when it is elected in 2017. Just a quick word on the work report which was delivered by Hu Jintao, which is the work report on the work of the previous outgoing Congress. We are all familiar with what he said about corruption, but it's worth repeating because they are very stark words that he has used, and that it would lead to the collapse of the party and the fall of the state. I can't remember hearing this kind of stark warning for a long, long time, especially since the stabilization after the Cultural Revolution. This kind of talk really is a wake-up call to the party. The other thing that is very striking, and this I'll dwell on later on, is on the need to change the economic model. The terms he used are, it is unbalanced, uncoordinated, and unsustainable. This unsustainable bit, by the way, is a conclusion we had ourselves reached in the VIF some months ago, because it was very clear that the kind of model on which they were depending could not be carried on the way they were working it. There is a reference, I think, an indirect one. The straight references to Taiwan are very mild, but this one I thought was a strong reference to be able to win a local war in an information age. I guess he's referring to Taiwan. And there is one last bit which is about consultative democracy. This is a new thought which has not been much in evidence in Chinese statements, especially by their top leaders, because consultative democracy, while it is an experiment undertaken in a province where Xi Jinping was a party leader, nevertheless does imply that the people have the right to reject a party-appointed leader, which is something that is going to be fought over. That's my guess. To sum up, these are the core interests that they have identified. Taiwan, Tibet, South China Sea. Sometime last year, late last year, they added their own domestic system as one of the other core issues for the party. And as you can see, there have been a very large number of social disturbances. 180,000 is the official figure. Social disturbance means any disturbance involving 15 or more people. Many of them perhaps would not be serious, but some of them certainly were, particularly in this province called Wuhan, where they actually reversed the party decision on certain industrial programs. I have touched upon the role of party elders, but I think it's worth bearing in mind that now there are going to be two party elders, namely Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao. Jiang Zemin is now 86 years old, hasn't been in very good health. So I think my own assessment is that Hu Jintao is willing to give way, A, because Jiang Zemin is the more popular leader, but also I think he's biding his time. He knows that time's on his side. He's much younger and in pretty good health. Now we are doing for time, but now we come to the implications for India. Our director mentioned in his introduction that economics is going to be really the driver of the interaction between all the major players in the Asia-Pacific region, and I'm going to try and elaborate on that a little bit. I'll begin with a extract from an article which was written by Giscard d'Estaing. I suppose you all know him, former president of France, former finance minister of France, and a man who understands economics quite well. The important thing is what he says here. Second sentence: traditionally, a US recovery has fueled exports of developing countries, increasing their orders of equipment goods from countries such as Japan, Germany, and France. And the interdependence between European countries has led to a diffusion in Europe of these expansionary forces. In short, this is very important to understand in how the current global economy is structured. People say, oh, you know, China is going to drive future growth. No way. No way. The way the world economy is structured, you can produce all you want if there is no effective demand for it. If there is no consumer for it, it's not going to get you anywhere. It's not going to get you profits, it's not going to get you high rates of GDP growth. And in this world today, the two main consumption areas are America and to a lesser extent the European Union. That is how, this is what Giscard is actually saying, that when America increases its demand for consumer goods, those countries that are producing it, it used to be the Europeans themselves in the 50s, then it shifted to Japan and the Asian tigers, and then it shifted finally to China. But none of them could do this on their own, and you see the proof of it. Once American consumption demand shifted to production coming out of Japan, Europe began to stagnate in the 80s. It was called eurosclerosis. Once they shifted away from Japan, and I'll give you figures on all this. Once they shifted away from Japan to China, to see what happened to Japan. They call them the lost decades. 20 years of virtually zero growth for Japan. This is the key to how the world economy is structured, and the key really to the power of the United States and the US dollar. Now, let's have a look at some tables. First table is about FDI. We are all familiar with what China enjoyed. We are all in awe of what the Chinese managed to achieve. But look at this. This is just a sampling which I've taken from the Asian Development Bank. 1990, see where the People's Republic is. 95, look at the huge spread. And the reason is that in 1994, China devalued its currency by 40%. The yuan was devalued by 40% on the 1st of January 1994. And you see the result. Immediately, FDI starts to shoot up. 97, 98, marginal growth. This is the period of the Asian financial crisis. And see what happens from 2003 onwards. China enters the WTO. China entered the WTO in 2001. There was no further doubt or hesitation about whether America would allow them MFN treatment. Earlier, you remember, it used to be on a year-by-year basis. And you see where it ends up in 2007. Record FDI. See what it does to the other countries, where otherwise the same FDI was going. Republic of Korea, look at the result. India does relatively well, but look at Malaysia. It collapses from 1998 onwards, becoming negative in 2007. Look at Japan, negative all the way through. And these are the numbers that really tell you what is happening in the world of economics. Now, next table. What the FDI does, you can see. Here, these are actually percentages. So, what you are looking at is the qualitative change that happens as a result of all these changes that we just saw in the previous table. Chinese exports to Asia decline in importance in their overall export basket from 67% to 40%. To Europe, the reverse. They grow from 14% to 23%. To America, this is say North and Central America, mainly the US, from 10% to 22%. Now, this is a pattern, which is to say declining exports to Asia and significant increases, something like 100% increases in the exports to Europe and America, is unique to China. You will not see it in any of the other countries. Whether you're talking India or you're talking Malaysia, Japan, everywhere you see the sharp decline in the percentage of exports to Europe. This is what really the US-China relationship has meant. Deep down, this is the basis on which the very special relationship between these two countries has been sustained. And the remarkable thing is, it has carried on regardless of what the president of the day says, and regardless of the color of the presidency. Democrat, Republican makes no difference. This is a standard pattern that continues until we come to the financial crash of 2008. Now, in a way, this is something we need to imbibe, internalize, because we, particularly India, has been one of the focus areas for American thinking on the Asia-Pacific region. And increasingly, we have been told that this rebalancing, this pivot, whatever you want to call it, India is the linchpin in the American thinking. People like me have always felt that there is something missing in this strategy, Because while on the security side, we are hearing all the right things, on the economic side, the reverse was happening. Now for the first time, you could say that the alignments are coming into order. What do I mean by that? I think everyone would have heard this thing that the US is borrowing dollars from China. The US is too dependent on China to be able to do anything about confronting, containing, balancing, rebalancing, whatever. Now, this is what I found when I actually looked at the numbers. In 2011, Chinese investments in US treasuries were $1.3 trillion. It has now dropped. This is, I'm talking about, the last figure is available for August, I think, August 2012. It has dropped to $1.1 trillion. In short, a disinvestment of $200 billion has taken place. And what is this? What does this add up to? $1.1 trillion? 6.85 of the American GDP, $16 trillion, which is also the American national debt. So the total exposure of America today is less than 7%. So the notion that America is dependent on Chinese money, Chinese loans, China buying their treasuries, no longer holds. Next please. Yeah, there you go. These are the table. This is the table. And I just wanted to, these are actually the two largest holders are still China and Japan. And you see how significantly Japan has increased its holding of American debt. I put India there not because it's a major buyer, but just to give you the impression, clarify that India has also made its small contribution to buying US debt. Now I'll quickly run through some of the priorities for America. Obviously, the economy comes number one, the fiscal cliff. The fiscal cliff, personally, in my opinion, there is less to it than meets the eye. What's going to happen is they will revert to the Clinton-era tax rates, and they did very well under Clinton, so it's not as if it's going to be the end of the US economy. It'll also force cuts across the board in their spending, which is no bad thing because America needs to do that anyway. If they can't decide it politically, let it be done administratively. Nevertheless, what is worth noting is that the talks are going on right now and both sides are showing flexibility. The Democrats are saying they are willing to cut some of the entitlements and the Republicans are saying they are willing to look at revenue raising options. They began by saying they only wanted loopholes to be plugged, but lately I've seen some of the senators especially are beginning to say that even tax rates need to be re-examined. The other foreign policy concerns China and the Asia-Pacific region, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and the broader Middle East. Iran will obviously be a top priority. The Eurozone continues to be an area of concern, but they seem to be muddling along for now. The pivot to Asia, I already touched upon. Priorities for China. The economy is obviously going to be their main concern, and I do want to emphasize this. The economy is in bad shape. The model which Hu Jintao refers to was heavily reliant on FDI. In fact, there is another UNCTAD study which shows that Chinese exports, or rather 60% of Chinese exports, were from economic entities that had foreign direct investment. So 60% of this export machine was reliant on foreign investments. And we've already seen Hu Jintao saying that the model is unsustainable. The Chinese know it. They're looking for an alternative which will be driven by domestic demand. Can they get there? The experience of the Eurozone, of Japan, of Korea, all suggest that it's going to be very hard. Korea, in fact, has run up a consumer debt which is of the order of 30% of their own GDP, and yet the economy is just about doing 4%. Not bad for an economy that size, but 4% isn't what they were doing. Corruption has been mentioned. Now, foreign policy, this is another thing we need to focus on. What China sees from Beijing, they've suffered a number of setbacks ever since they started flexing their muscles around 2007, which is the period when Hu Jintao really comes into his own. In the Asia-Pacific region, they've drawn a blank. They're having serious polemics with Japan, Philippines, Vietnam, Singapore. Only Cambodia within that region seems to be comfortable with China, nobody else. Myanmar is changing very rapidly, and the notion that the US president would visit would have been unthinkable even a year ago. And of course the Chinese, for all their demurrals, are concerned about it. And North Korea, last but not least, the young Kim is showing interesting signs of wanting to break out of the limitations that he has inherited. To my mind, it seems that China, the bright spot, and of course with India, things have gone very badly with India. And in our last few joint documents, we have stopped referring to one China, we have stopped referring to Tibet as a part of China. So the hard line that China has adopted in the last 5 years has really been counterproductive across the board. The bright spot that I think they can see is in the AFPAC region, and I suspect that we are going to see some serious frictions as the American drawdown draws closer. On India, there's really very little for me to say to an audience like you. The only point I want to make is that I think we are responding positively to both America and China, as we should, and we are looking very seriously at the kind of role that people want us to play in the South China Sea and the broader Indo-Pacific region, which is all to the good. The only thing is that I think we are either not expressing our concerns openly enough, or they're not being responded to in adequate measure. But the fact is that we have our set of problems with both Pakistan and China. And it's important to understand, when we make our commitments to the maritime strategy, what is it that we can expect from our partners to be. Normally, when we ask them what we can expect, they say, hey, look, this is not an international issue. Freedom of navigation at sea is an international issue. But what you are having is not international. To which I think we need to evolve some answers. And for me, there are two issues, Tibet and Kashmir, on which I think we can express our requirements. On Tibet, there are three issues which can attract international attention. One is the human rights situation, the other is the water diversion and the damming of the rivers, which affects not just India but a number of other countries in South Asia and Southeast Asia. And the third, of course, is that there is a UNGA resolution of 1961 calling for self-determination for Kashmir. Now, of course, the purist will tell you that a UNGA resolution is not like a UN Security Council resolution, which is true. But we should also remember that the state of Israel came into being as a result of a UNGA vote, not a Security Council vote. So it's not as if a vote in the General Assembly is of no value. On the Kashmir side, I think what's very important is that we should persuade the our Western partners and our partners in Asia Pacific. I don't know how many of you have noticed this, but since the 70s, the line of control in Kashmir, which used to stop at this point called NJ 9842, has been extended to the Karakoram Pass in a northeasterly direction. Now there's no basis for this. Legally, the agreement of 1949 says the line goes north to the glacier, and on the ground we are exactly along that line. So why has this been drawn? I haven't got a sorry, I have never got a clear answer to this, but I think this is something on which we can certainly negotiate with our partners to be, that this is the least we can expect in return for whatever we want to do together in the maritime space or the maritime dimension. Afghanistan, as I've already hinted, is the next hotspot, and I think it is important for us to understand that, China somehow has managed to keep a very low profile, but increasingly now people are beginning to comment on the approach of China to this region, and that it is not necessarily as negative towards the Taliban and the Islamic forces as many people presume. They presume that because of the problem in Xinjiang, the Chinese will be negative, but the fact is that when the Taliban were in power in Kabul, the Chinese did pretty good business with them. And of course, they are confident that with Pakistan on side, they can contain the negative fallout. In short, China is roughly where the United States were in the 80s. That yes, these are difficult partners to work with, but they are serving a larger purpose. In the American case, it was to destroy the Soviet Union. In China's case, to embarrass and worse for the United States. Now, China has also signed a treaty of friendship with Afghanistan and with Pakistan, and in both cases the text has never been published, so we don't really know what it says. But press comments suggest that in the treaty with Pakistan, they have committed to uphold the territorial integrity of Pakistan. The Americans have also made pretty strong commitments. I think there's a general sense that they are going to just cut and run. It's possible, but I wanted to read this excerpt from the Strategic Partnership Agreement. It says that in the event of any security danger, quote, the parties shall hold consultations on an urgent basis to develop and implement an appropriate response, including, as may be mutually determined, political, diplomatic, economic, or military measures in accordance with their respective constitutional procedures. This is actually stronger than the clause 9 of the Indo-Soviet Treaty. I am now coming to the last part, which is the Indian foreign policy choices. We are seeing the emergence, the glimmerings of a strategic realignment between really America and China to begin with, and then it will have its implications for the entire region. America has been very open about the growing weight they attach to India in their policy calculus. And for China, of course, India is important in one negative sense, which is that they don't want India to help in any way aggravating or destabilizing the situation in Tibet. Nevertheless, India is also becoming an important economic partner of both countries, especially China. As you see, their trade surplus has shrunk to 155 billion in 2011, out of which India contributed 40 billion. It's 25% of the surplus, because China today actually runs a deficit with the rest of the world. The only country, if you take America out of their trade pattern, they have a deficit with the rest of the world. But there are a few countries that are providing surpluses. India is one of them. So economically too, India is important. And I'm mentioning here the role of Walmart. This is an aspect which I think needs a little more attention, because Walmart is the largest private sector buyer of Chinese goods, $30 billion in 2011, whereas all of India bought $50 billion worth of Chinese goods. So wherever Walmart go, Chinese goods follow. This is something we need to bear in mind as we work our way through the FDI question. Finally, of course, I want to say that there is this issue going on about non-alignment being the right response. A number of people, both in India and abroad, are telling us that the best thing to do is to be non-aligned in the face of this. Non-aligned here is to be non-aligned with our own vital interests. It's also very important for us to maintain very good ties with some of the other major powers. And I can straight away think of Russia, France and Israel. Of course, Iran is a challenge, but we need Iran, and I think Iran is going to have, we're going to have to do some tightrope walking, if you like. Because this whole area is going to be unstable for the foreseeable future. You see what's happening in Egypt. So we're going to need to be prepared to be agile and intelligent in our responses. On some of the gaps in power, I just briefly mention this because people very frequently mention to us, one-fourth the size of China and so on, what dreams are you dreaming? The fact is that we're not one-fourth, actually we are one-third, which is bad enough. But if the rupee were to strengthen, we would be a $2 trillion economy. At 55 rupees we are not, at 50 rupees we are, 50 rupees to a dollar. But equally important, look at the gap between India and Pakistan, for instance. We're 10 times their size. Do you ever hear anyone saying to Pakistan, you were not tribal with India, we are 10 times your size? No, you don't. Likewise, China is half or less than half the US GDP. No one tells the Chinese, don't tribal with the Americans. So I think we need to stop paralyzing ourselves. And really what we need is a little political will and a little better organization. And that brings me to the last part, which is really organizing for our defense. Our economy is good. Our structurals are extremely good, far, far better than any of the major economies. And you can see the result just today. The Sensex has climbed 300 points, and Shanghai has fallen to the level of February 2009, which was the lowest point in the Chinese economy. So, this whole thing about China being on an inexorable steady rise, not true. India is doing very well economically. It's on the security side that we have a big problem. We neglected our defenses for the last 20 years or more, and it's time to fix that. Once that is done, and we don't need a huge lot of spending, yes, in the long run we do. The immediate requirement is to bring up our serviceability. Ammunition, spare parts, get this right, you're ready to defend yourself against any contingency. Last point is, I think, with all our major partners, we need a new platform for cooperation. I think we've come as far as we could with our Western partners and with China and with Russia. It's time now to review the entire platform and see how we take the relationships forward. Thank you.